Hi everyone, welcome to my stories. No voiceovers, no dialogues, just moments and what they make you feel. Today's story begins with a stranger found unconscious on the road, a half-built kitchen, and quiet tensions rising beneath the surface. Hit subscribe and stay with me through the silence. Morning light slipped gently across the quiet countryside, soft enough to hear the breeze weave through the bamboo groves. Along the familiar dirt path, Tieu pedaled slowly, an empty basket swaying behind her bicycle. She was headed toward her usual gourd patch, but her gaze snagged on something. Someone, lying still on the grassy roadside. She braked. The wheels turned sluggishly as she stepped off. A man, unfamiliar, pale, unmoving, no identification, no belongings, no sign of why he was here or how. Just a motionless body amid a scene too peaceful to make sense of him. She crouched, hand reaching toward skin that felt colder than she expected. His pulse, there, barely. His breath, shallow. In that moment, no options appeared. No questions asked. Only instinct. She turned, flagged down help, and together they brought him back to the modest home at the edge of the village. He was placed on an old wooden bed in the side kitchen, the air cooler there, a thin blanket drawn across his chest. Time passed. The sun dipped lower. Tieu sat under the porch eaves, arms around her knees, eyes fixed on the unmoving figure within. As dusk swallowed the day, mist crept in, and somewhere between fear and responsibility, she realized she was holding something too big to name, something she hadn't asked for and wasn't ready to carry. Early morning light filtered through the wooden slats of the small kitchen. A faint scent of herbal medicine still clung to the air. Tieu stirred the steaming bowl gently, her fingers trembling slightly after a sleepless night. The stranger lay motionless nearby, still breathing, but faintly, as if clinging to the day by a thread. She dipped a cloth into cool water, wrung it slowly, and wiped his forehead. Every motion was careful, deliberate, as though any sudden gesture might unravel something fragile. From time to time, she paused, eyes fixed on his face. Each time, her expression flickered between sympathy and unfamiliarity, and then something deeper, almost fear. Outside, sunlight crept higher. Birds sang from treetops, their melodies pressing gently against the silence within. But inside her, a quiet tension rose, a sense of being caught in something she hadn't chosen. She poured the medicine into a bowl, placed it near the bed, her movements barely making a sound. Whenever he stirred even slightly, she would flinch, not from alarm, but from the weight of not knowing who he was. The house felt different now, no longer just her home, but a space suspended, holding a presence that didn't belong, yet couldn't be ignored. Though no words passed between them, a silent thread had begun to stretch between her and the unconscious man. Invisible, unnamed, but binding in ways she hadn't yet understood. The sun had risen high, casting sharp light over the unfinished kitchen roof. Tieu stood alone atop the structure, carefully tying palm leaves in place. Sweat soaked her back, and her heartbeat thudded in sync with the heat, making the day feel longer than usual. Below her, the side room was silent. The stranger still lay there, unmoving, his chest rising and falling beneath a thin blanket. Now and then, her gaze drifted toward the window. Each glimpse of him, even still, even silent, stirred something unnameable inside her. Not quite fear, not exactly compassion, more like a weight, a quiet burden edged with doubt. She didn't know his name, yet somehow he had taken up space in her home, in her hours, in the fragile peace that once defined her days. Climbing down, she gathered the last bundles of palm leaves, carrying them inside one by one. The older woman had gone to the garden to harvest vegetables, leaving Tieu alone with the growing haze of uncertainty. The breeze swept through the porch, and with it came a strange hollowness, like something slipping through her grasp. By dusk, she sat on the step, fingertips gently pressing a scratch on her palm. Her face, dusted with sun and labor, held a look of quiet unrest, an ache that hadn't found its voice. Somewhere in her, a truth had begun to shift. If he were to wake, everything she had quietly held together might fall apart. Evening crept in slowly, and the last slants of light stretched across the brick courtyard. Tieu rinsed the soil from her hands, traces of earth still clinging beneath her nails. Sweat glistened faintly on her brow, a quiet fatigue settling over her. Inside, the stranger remained motionless, and the house held the same silence it had since his arrival. A motorbike stopped at the gate. Her head lifted instinctively, startled. Uri had arrived. He walked in, his gaze sweeping across the yard, finally landing on the side room's door, where something unseen seemed to pull at him. Without asking, he understood. Something had shifted. Uri stepped closer. His eyes searched hers. She nodded faintly, avoiding his stare. In that small moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of a burden she had quietly carried. His attention moved to the unconscious man, and a flicker of tension crossed his face. They sat across from each other at the low table. Neither spoke. Silence filled the space between them, not born of conflict, but of all the things left unsaid. Uri's eyes lingered on the untouched tea, now cold. Dusk wrapped itself around the house. His presence, though familiar, stirred the balance. What once felt still now trembled at the edges. And in that tension, Tieu realized, from the moment the stranger entered her life, nothing had remained as it was. The next day, the air inside the house had changed. Thicker, heavier. As if everything sensed that something no longer felt right. Uri sat at the wooden table, flipping through a stack of documents without truly reading them. His eyes drifted repeatedly toward the side room. The stranger still lay unconscious. Every time Uri passed by, he paused, gaze unreadable, emotions hidden in folds of uncertainty and quiet dread. Tieu stood in the yard, carefully brushing each bundle of palm leaves. Her expression was still, her silence deliberate. She glanced toward the house now and then, but didn't speak. The distance between them wasn't marked by words, but by what wasn't said. Each time their eyes met, they turned away, not out of coldness, but because some questions weighed too heavily for answers. The older woman returned from the back garden, holding a bowl of freshly brewed medicine. The tension thickened. Yuri stepped out to the porch, leaning one arm against a wooden pillar, staring out across the field with a furrowed brow. Inside, Tieu brought the medicine to the bedside. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. She sat beside the man, unmoving, her breath shallow. Between them all, something stirred, not explosive, not loud, but undeniable. An undercurrent rising just beneath the surface. And because none of them gave it voice, the silence between them only grew louder. The midday sun scorched the courtyard, casting a heavy heat that seemed to press against every surface. Tieu worked steadily atop the roof, tying the last bundles of palm leaves. Her hands were calloused, but her movements remained deliberate. Below, Uri stood motionless, watching. He didn't speak, didn't move to help, just observed, as though weighing something silently inside. Each gesture she made stirred something in him. Every shared glance between them landed like a quiet blow. Cool, restrained, unresolved. She didn't flinch. She didn't explain. She just kept working, perhaps trying to prove something. Though to him or to herself, she couldn't be sure. The older woman stepped out of the house, placing more palm leaves near the steps. She paused, eyes lingering on the two of them, her expression heavy with worry. The tension had grown too thick to hide, too wide to step over. It lived in shadows, footsteps, and the unspoken breath between them. Uri turned and entered the house. At the doorway, he stopped. His gaze fell on the unconscious man. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, brief but sharp enough to crack the air a little more. Tieu watched him disappear inside, her chest tightening. On the rooftop, a freshly tied palm leaf loosened, catching the wind, and fell, hitting the ground with a hollow thud. It echoed the weight between them, unspoken, widening, and cold. The afternoon dimmed under a quiet breeze. The house sat still, the only sound a steady breath from the side room. The stranger stirred. One hand clenched slightly. His eyelids trembled, then slowly opened. He stared at the ceiling, blank, distant, before turning his head to take in the room, confused, dazed, like returning from somewhere far away. Tieu, folding old cloth in the next room, paused at the faint sound. She turned, and their eyes met. In that split second, time stalled. No words, just a heavy exchange of gazes, both wary, uncertain. He moved, attempting to sit up. She stepped forward to help, but his eyes darted to a small bag in the corner. Something in his stare hardened, calculating, guarded. She noticed. Her hand paused mid-air, then retreated. His distrust spoke louder than words. Yuri entered quietly, standing at the threshold. His eyes flicked between the two. The room seemed to shrink, holding three people in silence, each wrapped in their own tension, yet sharing one fragile moment. The man reached for the bag. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. From inside, he pulled out a pair of glasses. Once on, his gaze sharpened. Suspicion and alertness overtook confusion. He looked at both of them, not with gratitude, but with caution. No one knew who he truly was, but in that moment, one thing was clear. Whatever truth lay ahead, it would not come gently.